everyone. Hello. Great to see such wonderful people here. Thanks so much for joining us. A very warm welcome to all of you. Before we kick on with the panel discussions, I'd love to introduce Maud Sturm to come up and offer the acknowledgement to country. Maud.
We begin today by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians on whose land we meet. I pay my respects to elders past, present and those emerging. Thank you.
Thank you, Maud. Ladies and gentlemen, Christopher Marr is my name. I'm proud to be one of the co-founders of this business, which we started about 6 years ago. And from where I'm standing to look at the smiling faces we have in the room here, it's particularly humbling to have such quality people join us today. Now, publishing Agents of Change, this terrific paper that's on your desk, courtesy, of course, of Andrea, who published this, was part of a natural evolution for our business. It was natural because we're in the business of well-being. We're in the business of leadership. But we were witnessing a paradox. The paradox existed because on one hand, we could see leaders that were putting themselves first. They were taking advantage of the goodwill of their teams, and the consequences of this were palpable. But on the other hand, of course, we saw leaders committing to action, committing to a higher purpose, putting their teams first, and generating thriving workplaces and environments. And this paper, Agents of Change, talks about some of the nuances of that distinction, of that paradox, and how the leaders of the future are driving change through these 5 different personas that Andrea has spoken about in this paper. To that end, I'd like to introduce some terrific panellists today. Firstly, Stephen Worrell. Stephen is the Managing Director of Microsoft for Australia and New Zealand. We met a few years ago paddling surf skis together alongside another mate, and so our relationship has been a friendly one. But also, Stephen's got this terrific story which we're going to hear about today in founding the Corporate Mental Health Alliance alongside his other typical executive roles. Mel Silver, the Managing Director of ANZ for Google. Of course, this is one of the world's most significant businesses. They've got a huge workforce that spans globally, and we're going to hear some insights from Mel and how she's an agent of change. Heidi Beck. Heidi's Chief People Officer of Global Express, or Team Global Express as they're now known. Wonderful customer of ours, super pleased to have you join us and offer your insights today, Heidi. And of course, Elle Dias. Elle comes from one of my favourite businesses, or favourite brands at least. She's the head of HR APAC for Red Bull, which is, I think we could all imagine it does some pretty extraordinary things. We know that truly transformational change only happens when leaders commit to action. That's what we're going to see today. We're going to hear about the experience, hear about the insights, and to get things off, I'd love to introduce Heidi and Elle to the stage, please.
Hi.
So I've been furnished here with some statistics, which was always a good way to prompt conversation. Last year, this business, Sonder, we interviewed just over 1,000 Australians, 1,025. So I think this is a statistically relevant study. All these workers had a minimum of 20 hours per week in employment. We found 3 important things, 3 important insights, which I'd like to share. Number 1, many employees aren't well. What does that mean? Well, 72% by our counting employees have felt depressed or have in the past, in the last 12 months, 72%, quite extraordinary. 25% of employees, sadly, have contemplated or are contemplating suicide, 25%. So we know that employees, they're not particularly well. The consequence of this, of course, is that the workplaces aren't very well either in some respects. 50% of employees have been subjected to bullying or harassment throughout their career, 50%. 35% have experienced aggression from their manager. I find that an extraordinary statistic, 35. A third of people have had aggression, which is an interesting word to use, from their manager, from their direct report. The consequence of that, of course, is that poor wellbeing is affecting workplace productivity. And that's where, you know, if you don't want to create change for the right and very obvious and proper reasons of humanity, then of course it's affecting the bottom line as well. We know that 42% of workers took time off in the last 12 months because of their own mental wellbeing and health. We know that 26% of people took time off to support a family member who was going through some mental health challenge. So it's a clear, I think, indication that things need to change. When it came to questions about leadership, 75% said that seeing or hearing leaders talk about their own mental wellbeing challenges gave them the confidence to talk about their own, promoting that internal action and advocacy. That's particularly powerful. Many of the data points out there show that actions from organisational leaders such as you, can make the difference in someone's lives. So as it relates to us here, as Wellbeing and Safety Company, we're serving about 500,000 people, largely in Australia and New Zealand, but it does extend to about 90 countries around the world in some instances. Customers such as Woolworths Group, PwC, Team Global Express, Allianz, Hoyts, Probe, NRMA, Uni Sydney, New South Wales State Government, a host, Hayes. And we're seeing, because of that really broad spread of insight that we have, the benefit of this knowledge and data and the conversations we get to have, we get, I think, this extraordinary insight into the health of the country as a whole, and that's what we're going to try and peel into today. We've proposed in this terrific paper, and again, thanks to you, Andrea, for drafting this, that there are 5 key roles that agents of change produce. And just in case there are people in the crowd that haven't gone through it, I'll just summarise this very briefly. Number 1 is the embracer. An embracer is someone who, of course, embraces and doesn't delegate their responsibility for well-being. An investigator, someone who looks for evidence rather than focusing on the myths or the quick wins or the easy outcomes. The challenger, someone who challenges the status quo, breaks conventions. The integrator, someone who embeds wellbeing into their organisation, sees it as a function of their entire commitment to their operational outcome. And the advocator, someone who walks the talk and is vocal about social change. So I'd like to get started with the panel, but to give a little bit more of a detailed introduction, as mentioned, Heidi Beck is the Chief People Officer at Team Global Express. Her CV includes senior strategy roles at both Westpac and at Qantas, as well as 10 years as a management consultant at the famous McKinsey & Company. I think that'd be sort of world-renowned as probably the most significant strategic consulting firm. Elle, from Red Bull, of course, my favourite. She's the area head of HR for Australia Pacific, and previously the Middle East and Africa was in your remit as well, I understand, Elle. Prior to 12 years at Red Bull, Elle spent 7 years at HR at Unilever, and I think Unilever is perhaps the most significant food brand globally. Is that fair? Is there anyone from Unilever here? Probably eating their food. Cool, so let's welcome both Heidi and Elle. So Heidi, I'm going to start with you. At Sonder, we believe wellbeing is more than an employee benefit. We believe that it's fundamental to the good outcomes and productivity of a business, and it should underpin company culture. What does it mean to you and your organisation?
It is everything. It is well-being is an absolute critical component of safety. And if you're in any operational business, if you run an airline, if you run an airline, if you're out there in trucks, if you're doing courier, if you're doing anything that puts you in that front line, you are that company's product, and that product is based on what you do being safe and efficient and productive. If you're not at your best and you're not well and you're distracted by anything causing those distractions, that puts those people you come in contact with at risk. That puts the plant and equipment at risk. that puts the company ultimately, important you come at it from those three angles, but that well-being and being physically fit and well-being, the country and the industry is rightfully shifting from, it's not just have I had enough sleep and am I physically qualified and physically fit to do the job, am I also mentally present and mentally there? So it's everything is what it is. And if you look at the back of the last 2 years, in these industries, these are the ones where people have been put at the most stress. You put those statistics, and as much as I don't like those statistics, they're not surprising to me, because you put people in incredibly deep, stressful experiences for the whole last 2 years, challenging every definition of what it means to be well.
Heidi, I'm now running off script. I hope you don't mind, Jason. Heidi, one of our customers is Woolworths Group, and over the pandemic, of course, and this happens every day, but they're feeding the nation.
Absolutely.
It's a 24/7 supply chain, and of course, there's huge purpose to that for an employee.
Yeah.
I expect that this is the same at Team Global Express.
Well, Woolworths is one of our biggest customers on that side, because they are running and their food is getting delivered on our trucks. So they're feeding the nation from the actual supermarkets. We were feeding the nation because we were actually bringing all of that food from point A to point B and across the nation to actually get into those supermarkets.
Do you think the team, when you think about well-being,
Yep.
do you think the team has that at the sort of frontal lobes of consideration, that their performance any day, you're a supply chain operator, and you could form a view that this is an almost transactional job, but actually, if you were to sort of think about the impact that you're having for the country, this is really, really important stuff.
And it's important in the context of the five kind of elements in terms of change agents that you've got. That is actually one of our critical kind of strategic pieces of why we are now a separate business from what used to be the toll group. It is that repositioning this around those customers and that broader, bigger purpose, and actually thinking about it. It's not just, we don't run trucks and deliver stuff from that one. It's we put things on airplanes that are delivering valuable surgical materials across the country. We're moving the nation's food in terms of Woolworths on that side of it, and from that perspective. Because we run trucks, we're one of the largest emitters, and looking at what we do from a carbon and an ESG and emissions actually can be one of the biggest components in driving things down and improving the business into it. It is about repositioning our people around that broader, bigger purpose, and we do that by using this equipment to move things from A to B. But it is about that broader perspective of literally linking the nation and customers together.
Terrific, thank you. Elle, switching to you, if we were to think about the investigator role, and to remind you of that, this is sort of evidence and rigour around the programs that you might bring into the organisation. What do you see as best practice in organisational wellbeing at Red Bull?
With Red Bull, we give wings to people and ideas. That's what we're about. And we want everyone in our organisation to be at their best all the time. We also have a lot of young employees, so young managers. So for us, it's really important that we give the individuals the tools that they need to support their teams. So we do a lot of training around resilience. What we do in terms of integrating is we really make sure that it's on brand with our company culture. So when we run resilience training, it's surfing in a storm, so we really link it back to our audience and our employees. One of the other things at Red Bull is we're a strengths-based organisation, so we want to get to know all our individuals. We want to know what their strengths are, and then how can we support them once we actually get to know them quite well. And we have a tool that Red Bull's developed themselves called Red Bull Wing Finder. There's a plug because it's free and you can all do it if you're interested afterwards. But that tool is something that we really use within our business to be able to navigate, to get to know people. Like the statistics you shared earlier are just so scary. But I think it starts with the managers building those relationships with their team beyond work. And our whole performance management philosophy is focusing on the artist, not just the music. So we really integrate our brand and our culture internally on the topic of well-being. One of the other things that we focus on is we provide things like, other organisations might call it life leave, we call it wings leave. And it's the opportunity for individuals to have an extra 2 days off a year to spend it on what they need to spend it on. So whether that be caring, an extra caring time, whether that be going on a retreat, whether that might be attending a charity or a function of their interest. So it's definitely many initiatives are there to be tailored so the individual can decide what it is they need. We provide a wellbeing allowance, and that allowance, again, an individual can decide how they want to spend that, whether it be massages, surfing lessons, a health retreat. And so we really try and make sure that we understand the individual, and then we provide tools for the individual to be able to say what works for them, because wellbeing is not a magic wand, a one size fits all. And it's not the same throughout your life cycle either. You need different things at different points in your life. And so to have that level of flexibility, I think is really important for us. We also have a global charity called Wings for Life. And this global charity once a year runs an event called the Wings for Life World Run. And that is for spinal cord research. And so as an organisation, globally, at the same time around the world, we walk as a community, as a team, with the public, with our consumers, with our customers, to come along and support such an event.
And Elle, you mentioned that you've got a particularly young workforce. Are there unique challenges that exist with a workforce like that? Maybe there's a little bit less maturity or experience.
Yep.
How does that manifest?
Definitely, what we do see, we have a lot of student marketeers that you'll see on university campuses that are trialling Red Bull on actual universities. Sometimes those individuals that will then convert to a full-time role, and then before you know it, they've got 10 or 15 people reporting to them. So we do have a very young workforce, and so for us, we need to be able to upskill these managers with the right timing. So we always had quite a lot of training and support provided for our managers. COVID then made us put even more support in place. You know, COVID, for the first time, we had managers managing people remotely. They had no idea how to manage someone remotely. We had people that, you know, had a lot going on, just like your statistics share, and they needed a lot more emotional support. Our managers didn't know what to do.
But how did you do that? How did you inculcate that junior leadership with the skills to go and put wellbeing first?
Yeah, it was a lot of training. So we made sure that we put even more training in place. We put a lot more check-ins. So from the senior leadership team down, to make sure that they were checking in on their managers and on their managers and on their managers, so that all the best practice and the learnings as it was rolling out very quickly remotely, that we were supporting. And we also had, looking after APAC, we've got countries now that are still going in and out of lockdown. It's foreign to us here in Sydney, but it's still happening in the other parts of Asia. And so what we did do was, as a leadership team in the region, we constantly were sharing best practice as it was being rolled out, from, you know, online exercise training to meditation to yoga to just having lunch together online and spending some time together. We were just in contact and sharing what we were doing as it was rolling out. I think where we're really fortunate as well as an organisation is we have access to world-class athletes. So quite often these world-class athletes come in, they'll share their stories, how they manage their exercise routine, their well-being, how can they be at their best. And so we're lucky to be able to invite these external and our athletes as part of our community to support and help us as well.
Yeah, fascinating. And Heidi, to switch it back to you, you're running a huge organisation. It's across, you know, a large number of jurisdictions, foreign jurisdictions, 24/7 operations, supply chain. You must have young people, old, more experienced people. If we were to think about the integrator role, making sure that these wellbeing practices are pushed into the organisation through all those little nooks and crannies, how does that come to life for Team Global Express?
In a few different ways, and it's probably first we tend to skew older in terms of, because of the industry on that one, and that comes with its own challenges as well, because you've got individuals and employees who've been somewhere 20, 30, sometimes 40 years that are managing that stress and well-being of what's next and what's that kind of next phase in their kind of life, while you're trying to reinvigorate with younger. And when you cross over generations, that's an interesting kind of position in that space. Some of the ways that I know we, over the last couple of years, some of that integrating has actually been quite a challenge, because you've got about a third of people that are able to work from within an office or within a depot, or by a government definition from home, and others that just physically can't. And that separation and divide on how you navigate the challenges and the stresses in there was actually quite a tough thing to kind of manage on wellbeing, because for some it's the isolation and the seclusion and having to get an older generation digitally enabled that maybe never really had been in lots of ways before. And for others, through 2 years of stress around the challenges of health outcomes and rules and regulations and even unknowns of a disease on that one, that's a whole different level of stress before you even begin to think about the people who are trying to get into WA and the impacts to family or the impacts of all the various rules and lockdowns or even vaccine mandates. Because those were hard decisions on how you change and how you incorporate and what positions you take as a company when everything's changing around you across the board. I think we took 3 basic approaches. Since we've been acquired by Allegro, we've had over the last 12 months 3 basic approaches, and the first is an honesty and transparency around anything. If the rules and the laws and the governance is changing, just acknowledging it's changing and we're adapting to meet it, rather than trying to articulate anything else. There's a bit of a team approach on everyone being a little bit in it together too, if you're acknowledging it that way, but calling it out, having more of those conversations. Bringing on Sonder was a major part of it, which was we need something that digitally enables, that thinks about it more broad, because our statistics with our prior, more traditional EAP provider were the type that you didn't even need to put them on a dashboard or statistic. You could talk about the last handful over the last 24 months of usage moments, which is just not best practice, not actually focused on what's really going to make people better.
We spoke about purpose
Yep.
before, and I don't sort of want to offer a dichotomy if it doesn't exist, but I'm sort of interested in that you could almost consider this in 2 different ways. One, that purpose sits at the centre and people are sort of streaming towards that and giving them the courage to go a little bit beyond and sort of support that national supply chain, that critical infrastructure, really. The other is that, hey, I'm getting overworked and I feel like the country's relying on me and sort of stuff you a little bit. Like, did you see both of those sides of things, and how
Absolutely.
did you leverage each of them?
We're still dealing with the impact on burnout. So the important context for the 15,000 people who do work for us every day in that is it's not just a pandemic that's been involved. It's a complete divestment and from Japan Post and the toll group. So it's a major M&A piece of activity which changes things quite significantly. The toll group prior to that had the bushfires to kind of walk through, which was not small in a normal phase, but kind of got lost in the spirit of a pandemic. And 2 massive cyber attacks of equal size to what Optus has gone through in the last month. All of that is in the last 2.5 years of corporate memory for those 15,000 people on our ground. And it's this constant state of high pressure, high intensity kind of activity. So we've seen all of it. You see all of it in terms of all of those impacts on what and where and all those end results of behaviours. If you don't catch it, you don't make anything go forward.
Heidi, do you think that's reset the new norm, or do you think there's a requirement here to reset?
I think that the whole country, and this is probably a personal opinion more than anything, I think the whole country is having to learn to adapt to a new norm of things that are more ambiguous, more cyclical. The pace of change is rapid. I can't remember where I'd read it, but someone was talked about technological innovations. If you go back into the 50s and 60s, things would take these longer curves of sometimes months or years before technology, and now that speed up of that half-life to new things is dramatic. And I think that you're seeing that in the same spot in terms of change. Change is constant. It's about how do you create people that can adapt and address to that change and recognize that in a way and recognize that ambiguity and work through it. And how do you create in leaders that calmness and that ability to recognize that and see and know how to adapt to people in terms of doing that, especially as we're going through a generational change as well.
Thank you. Elle, coming back to you, do we have, how are we going for time, Jace? 2 minutes, or 2 questions? 2 questions. Good on you, mate. Then to come back to you, Elle, thinking about the advocator role, we've spoken a bit about that already, we've adjacent to it at least. To remind you of that, of course, is sort of the champion of change within an organisation. As head of P&C, what's your ask of your organisation to empower you better to support your people?
I think on this one, I think it's really important that we're constantly learning and developing ourselves. There's so many amazing podcasts, panels, newsletters, reading. So I think we've got to constantly be the forefront. We've got to have the knowledge to be able to support the business on wellbeing. I would say also that we've all got to lead by example, and I think the storytelling and us as leaders sharing our stories and being able to share with our employees and our teams what we do, how we cope, how we manage wellbeing as individuals. I think that's definitely really important for us. And then I think finally I would say is that we need to be able to talk to our employees, because like I said earlier, I don't think wellbeing, there isn't a magic wand, there's not the silver bullet. And so the closer that we are to our employees around what they need and how they need it, we need to be able to adapt and change with what they're requiring. So I think the closer that we can be with understanding from our employees can only help us to drive the agenda even forward.
Thank you. And Heidi?
You've said a lot of what I would have said in terms of that. I'm going to echo 100% on that one. I think I also ask of all of my peers and the rest of my business for that authenticity of just recognizing when things are not okay, and acknowledge and say that, because sometimes that's the most openness, is that there's that vulnerable part of it. One of the examples that I can think of that's gotten some of the best kind of feedback in the group was when some of our senior leaders, when you do get COVID, there's that, or they're taking the time off, they've actually been sick, instead of just really pushing through or soldiering on at home, it's that acknowledgement of saying, I'm not feeling well, I'm actually sick today, I'm going to drop this stuff and I'm not going to get there. That vulnerability, especially for anyone over the age of 35, who that shift is so there, sends that leadership shadow out to people around, actually, my well-being matters, my family's well-being matters, therefore yours does too. And sometimes that's the most impactful thing you can do. That's some of the things I ask of others, is actually that authenticity and that honesty of how are you really going, and also calling things out when you see them. Yeah. It's not, and that's a little bit easy in an operational business where you can call out that safety hazard or call that physical one out, but call things out when you see them on the, you look really tired and exhausted today, or it looks like something's kind of really wrong, would you like to talk, and kind of position it. Those are some of the most powerful conversations. They can be uncomfortable, and as you said, you've got to teach especially younger or newer leaders, regardless of age, how to have those in a way that's compassionate. But that's what I'd like to see, in addition to where you said to be able to help actually bring well-being into just that mainstream.
Thank you. That's really powerful. So we've not seen the last of Elle and Heidi today. After lunch, we're going to see Stephen and Mel. But then, of course, we're going to have everyone back on stage for questions. I'm sure there's plenty of them. There were some beautiful insights in there, which I'm personally keen to dive into. So if you join with me in thanking Elle and Heidi, and we'll enjoy some lunch.